Welcome to Biota Live. I'm Tom Barbalet, and this is a continuation of the Biota podcast. For more information on the Biota podcasts, go to biota.org/podcast. We have our first caller.
Hello there, Tom.
Hello, Gerald. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm finally in the same time zone, more or less.
Well, give or take 3 hours. It feels like the same time zone. As you know, we have news and notes, and then we'll get into this evening's topic. If you would like to call in, like Gerald, the call-in number 646-200-0640. We have an active chat room for folks who don't want to call a US number. The chat room's been relatively quiet over the past few episodes, so if you are listening live via Blog Talk Radio, I recommend you join in via the chat room because this evening's topic is going to be particularly interesting. The show next week, August 15th, 8 p.m. Pacific, Friday, an artificial quality of life. This is the second of two hard topics that we're putting out following A-Life 11, the first being this evening. And this discusses the current quality of life of artificial life developers, those in academia, those in industry, and those of us that are independent, and how we can look towards the future in terms of improving the various quality of life issues that seem to plague some or many of us with regards to, I guess, being independent software engineers or academics or all of the above. And in some regard, it ties in a bit with this evening's topic. The following Friday, August 22nd, 8 p.m. Pacific, Zan Gill discusses her book and other related ideas and potential discussions with regards to quality of life, the future, the history of artificial life, all the stuff that we're talking about over the next 2 weeks. For folks interested in seeing and hearing more about Zan's work, I put the Graytham Silicon Valley video of Zan in the Graytham blog. So go to Graytham with an e.org/blog and scroll down and you should see my link through to Zan Gill's video that was very nicely put online by Al Lundell. The following few weeks, I've had 3 topics suggested. The first came from Bruce Damer, and that is artificial life isn't just genetic algorithms. Bruce and I have exchanged some correspondence today with regards to what the current definition of artificial life is, particularly with regards to genetic algorithms, phenotypes, genotypes, and how far the definition has really come from about a decade ago. So that will be an interesting topic, particularly for folks who are tuning in for the first time from the A-Life 11 conference. As I know, a number of different areas were touched on through the conference that has just concluded. A topic from Scott Davis, open source and artificial life revisited. He wanted a greater degree of discussion with regards to open source licenses, how artificial life developers can bring their software together through things like the Evo Grid and future projects. And this is an ongoing discussion, I guess, in the Biota community with regards to open source and how it has benefited and how it can strengthen artificial life. In addition, Scott Davis requested promoting artificial life projects a how-to. Some discussion with regards to how to promote your artificial life project, and I think certainly through things like Graytham and Biota, certainly the Biota podcast, as it's listened to by more people, people do actually scroll down the Biota podcast link section. So if you appear on this podcast, if you appear on Biota Live, if you correspond with me or in some way get into the Biota-related discussion, it will promote your project. But that's a little sideline associated to that topic, which I think will probably be discussed in early September, the way the topics are panning out. So, some news and notes. The Facebook groups. I came to a bit of an epiphany during the week and realized that I should probably befriend all the people who were on the Facebook groups associated with Biota and also the ones associated with Noble Ape, because many of them live in areas where there are existing Graytham groups or where there is a potential for future Graytham groups. And if we look at Graytham Brighton, for example, the two folk associated with that, one of whom is Jamie Matthews, found each other through the Biota Facebook group. So if you have a Facebook account and you're interested in becoming part of the Biota Facebook group, you will pretty quickly be befriended by me, who will try to instigate some attendance to a Graytham meeting or additional contacts to the artificial life community in your area. It's somewhat of a cliched narrative, but when I picked up the Biota mailing list, I went through and found a number of people that were in a number of collected areas, but at the time I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to contact them all individually. However, through something like Facebook, it gives me a great opportunity to actually bring together like-minded folk to discuss artificial life in their area. Well, news from A-Life 11. We had 2, I don't know whether you'd call them embedded reporters, but we had Jamie Matthews, who I'll be talking with tomorrow and whose podcast chat will go out in the feed probably soon following this very one, and also Larry Yeager. And Larry sent me about 6 pages worth of notes associated with A-Life 11, which I'll try to put in with regards to the Jamie Matthews discussion as well. It looks like an amazing conference. I was looking at Jamie Matthews' photos. There seems to be a lot of graduate students, a lot of familiar faces, and just a whole lot of young blood, basically, coming through Artificial Life. Fascinating group. We'll talk more with Jamie tomorrow about that. And also the Biota CDs made it into everyone's knapsack. They seem to have cloth knapsacks that they gave out at the conference, and apparently they were all stuffed with Biota CDs. So Graytham news. There was a meeting at Graytham, Boston, this week. I haven't heard any news back, although I've had some correspondence with regards to other matters from Brian in Boston. Gerald, the Netherlands, are you folk going to have a Graytham meeting in the near future?
Yeah, well, I've been talking to a fellow who's got a really nice location for the second Graytham, which is going to probably take place in early September. So that hasn't been nailed down quite yet, but I'm sure it'll happen sometime either towards the end of August or the beginning of September. And it should be in a theater in The Hague.
Now, is there any kind of descriptive term with regards to that part of Europe that overlaps the Netherlands and that kind of area? There seems to be a lot of interconnected cities and things like that. Is there a general descriptive term for that area of Europe?
Well, there's often a word used for the combination of Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It's called the Benelux. And there's also a name for the big cities in Holland when you gather them all together, because they basically connect together very closely, and that's called the, in Dutch it's the Randstad, it's called the fringe city. So it's like one city essentially, which extends all the way from Utrecht through Amsterdam and down through The Hague to Rotterdam.
Because there are certainly a lot of folk in that general area. I would imagine probably within 2 or 3 hours of travel from the areas that you're talking about. So as I kind of group people together in particular Graytham chapter areas, I'll point some dialogue in your direction with regards to what the transit times will be and where the epicenter for these kind of things will end up being.
I'm going to try and get more participation from people who are currently in academia, because there's probably a good number of people working on projects related. And hopefully, last time, I forget the name of the guy we were talking to before, the guy who had the plant simulations, but I hope to get him up to talk.
Stefan, yes. I have some old friends in that part of the world as well who were big in the kind of early artistic artificial life community in Australia, who I think I'd CC'd some correspondence with you to try and get them up to wherever you hold it in the future as well, because I think there's certainly a number of different communities that could all benefit from having a Graytham in that part of the world. News from Silicon Valley. The next Graytham Silicon Valley meeting, I believe, is happening at the end of this month. Osher Yadka, who has been holding a majority of the Graytham Silicon Valleys at SRI, will present his work, which will be wonderful. And I also asked if Scott Davis, who has appeared on previous Biota Lives, or at least a previous Biota Live, would give a demonstration of Mars Sim and perhaps have some dialogue with John Cumbers with regards to simulating astrobiology and colonization and all these kind of issues, because it would be wonderful to have some video footage of Scott's work and also some additional dialogue. I think that's the ideal setting, basically, for people who are coming into the artificial life community and see that there is potential for artificial life in their work, to present their work and just get some general dialogue going. Although due to the numbers at the last one, I'm not clear. From the photos, there seem to be about 30 or 40 people, and the information I got back from Scott Schaefer was that there were about 70 people that actually attended Graytham Silicon Valley. So in those kind of numbers, it's always quite difficult to get a genuine discussion going, but maybe they'll break up into groups, or maybe there'll be some a high-level dialogue which will motivate future collaborations. Well, I have 2 apologies this evening. Steve Grand was going to be a part of this conversation. Obviously, when you talk about the history of artificial life, Steve Grand has been at a number of points, a number of places with regards to the history of artificial life. So he sends his apologies. And Bruce Damer as well was going to appear. However, 888 or 8808 is the 10-year anniversary of his farm. So I spoke to Galen today and passed on my congratulations to them both for operating the farm. He's been doing a lot of work recently with regards to creating numerous speaking and artistic areas on his farm. If you go to damer.com, you'll see some of the photos. However, I've seen some more recent photos which have wonderful paths and various other areas that, breakaway groups could congregate. The dome apparently is up and functional, where I believe there will be future Biota-related discussions. So it's wonderful that we will have a speaking space in the future in the Bay Area, which can be dedicated to podcast recordings and mini-conferences and breakaways and things like that. Have you ever visited Bruce in the Bay Area, Gerald?
I was wondering if you had been there, because I was there one time when I was going to Java 1, and I stayed at his house for a day or two. It's a lovely area. I mean, it's a wonderful place.
I've never been to Bruce's property. I lived in the Bay Area for about 18 months, and I spoke to Bruce on the phone maybe 2 or 3 times over that period. But I'm not sure what he was doing at the time. I seem to recall he was either consulting for Apple or he was doing some consultancy, and I was doing some other stuff in the Bay Area. We never actually crossed paths there. The first time we met was down in LA in, I want to say, 2005, although obviously we'd been in correspondence and, you know, a wide variety of connections prior to then. And then he was in Las Vegas, I want to say last year, but maybe even the year before. So we got together again, and he was able to meet Michelle, and I'm yet to meet Galen, actually. So there are a wide variety of people I'd like to meet in the Bay Area, and to do it on Bruce's property would be a wonderful thing. I also have obviously a background interest in the history of computing. The DigiBarn, I think, is going to be a place that I spend some quality time when I actually get to Bruce's land. But it looks like a wonderful space. I'm not sure if you've seen the photos online, Gerald. Have you had an opportunity to see Bruce's new?
I haven't seen the latest things, no, but I certainly remember the area, because we went for little hikes around the neighborhood, and it's a very hilly and very green area. It's lovely.
Yeah, there's a bed and breakfast about 10 minutes walk away, and that was certainly what I was considering if I go and visit Bruce, because, yeah, it does look like a very beautiful area. I've driven through that area a couple of times when I lived in the Bay Area, but I've never looked in on Bruce's property specifically. The Google Street View is remarkably good for wandering around the area. I've done a virtual wander around the area from Google Street View, which gave me a sense of the terrain and these kind of things, as it does. Anyway, for folks interested in calling in and participating in this evening's discussion, the contact number 646-200-0640. We have an active chat room if you're listening via Blog Talk Radio, where you can participate as well. So, Gerald, in terms of the history of artificial life, when you describe the history of artificial life to someone, perhaps a novice or someone who's artificial life curious, where do you begin?
The first thing that I think always comes up is Conway, because that's the first example that people typically recognize. And then I personally quickly go over to Tom Ray's Tierra, because that was, to me, the most sort of shocking example of something that was really a surprise. And of course, everyone refers to Carl Sims' stuff, although it's sort of surprising that both of those actually, completely disappeared from the landscape quite quickly.
This is certainly one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this topic this evening is that the history of artificial life, everyone has a different history of artificial life. And it's interesting that you start with Conway, because I was trying to draw up 4 or 5 possible histories of artificial life that were all relatively internally coherent. And Conway is certainly, as you say, one of the most universal starting point. However, a history that I prefer to use in some regard, which Bruce has picked up along the way, is the idea that artificial life predates computation. Certainly with my own stuff, it goes back to Bertrand Russell, and the stuff prior to Bertrand Russell, I mean, the stuff in Plato, basically, that is effectively about automata and observations, kind of secondary and tertiary observations of the real world. And I think there's strong artificial life narratives that come from Plato through philosophy, and Bertrand Russell in particular talks about things that I think are very heavily vening into artificial life. So you can then say, well, maybe Freeman Dyson in, I guess, the late 60s, early 70s, and then Conway, and then if you want to, talk about Chris Langton and these kind of people. But the curious thing with regards to the history of artificial life is the gap in the history of artificial life. And that, I guess, occurs somewhere in the early to mid-90s. In order to really discuss this topic, I think we probably need to explore what history is in a kind of functional and descriptive purpose. And certainly in my discussions with Bruce with regards to, for example, the history of computing, this is something which has been simplified and reduced, particularly in the past decade, to something which is almost completely fictitious and mythological. And certainly when you look at the history of computing or general aspects of history associated with periods of time, even relatively recent periods of time, there is an element of simplification, an element of loss, and I think certainly the contemporary history of artificial life has lost a large period of time. So in a somewhat abstract sense, I wanted to deconstruct this evening and also talk with you, Gerald, in terms of how it can be reconstructed into something that is meaningful for contemporary artificial life developers. Just out of curiosity, when you give the history of artificial life, how do you move from, say, 1990 through to 2000?
You know, I don't go through it in a chronological way, as you know, sort of painting a picture of continuity, because it doesn't seem to be there. You know, there's a sense in which, you know, when you read about and really come to understand what Tom Ray did, there's a sense that you know, when you understand that, to think, you know, there's something really big is going to happen, and then, you know, it just vanished. So like what exactly? It's like it was going somewhere and then it stopped, and then it probably took on another form again. But maybe these are just the fits and starts, you know, in the first years of the real implementations.
Certainly, that seems to be a coherent narrative in some regard. I'm not sure if you heard the end of Bruce's talk in London when Larry Yeager chimed in towards the end.
Yeah, I heard that, yeah.
I think I found particularly fascinating because it's people like Larry and, to a certain extent, people like Steve Grand who are still part of the discussion who can give this wonderful insight into periods of time in artificial life history, which we don't necessarily... I mean, you went to Biota 2, so maybe we could explore a little bit about Biota 2 in terms of sitting in the presence of people like Tom Ray and Richard Dawkins and people who are really tied in some regard to this history/mythology associated with artificial life. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of your own kind of historical perspective and what you may have learned through Biota 2?
Well, Biota 2 was for me a huge eye-opener because of the people, the caliber of the people that were there and the variety, actually, because there were a number of people who really took a philosophical approach to describing you know, artificial life in terms of like what it could become. Chris Langton, for example, he came to do his talk, and he didn't have PowerPoint or anything. What he did was he took those you know, transparent sheets of plastic and on a you know, a regular projecting overhead projector, and he just got a pen and he drew pictures of how it would proceed into the future in the form of just several lines, and he just discussed, will it be the case that artificial life and life actually join at some point in the future, or will life end and artificial life go on? So he just drew just these you know, incredibly sparse little line drawings and described you know, the possible futures of it. And then there was an elaborate discussion of symbiogenesis, Lynn Margolish stuff. Yeah, there was a variety of discussions. Not so much, you know, it wasn't a number of practitioners who were describing what they had done, but it was more, you know, there were several practitioners, and I also got up for a few minutes as well. You know, it was more of a philosophical thing, more of a discussion of where it came from and what it might become. It's very speculative.
Certainly, and the fascinating thing with Christopher Langton is the impact that he had on Marc Bedeau. So when I interviewed Marc Bedeau still has in some regard this view that artificial life is part of that, as you say, the spreading lines that Chris Langton drew on the overhead, and the insights that Langton offered in those spreading lines, I think, has really stuck with Marc Bedeau up until this day. And certainly the stuff that goes through the Artificial Life Journal does follow quite closely along with Langton's original vision.
We were also privileged to see, you know, Richard Dawkins give us a bit of a story, not necessarily about artificial life, but about, you know, genetics and how you know, the requirements for evolution in terms of like what he describes as fidelity, fecundity, and longevity. And he was describing, for example, his main example was kind of origami. So he said, if I fold this piece of paper, and he proceeded to fold some origami, And then would ask the first person in the front row to do the same thing, and they would make an attempt, and the second person would watch the first person, and the third person would watch the second person, etc. By the end of the first row, the knowledge of how to fold that origami would be completely gone. And he said, in what DNA does is it actually records it in terms of instructions. So if you were to give the instructions and pass that on to everyone, then you could have 100% accuracy in the reproduction of it. So it was, these kinds of very sort of tactile descriptions of the process of real life was really informative.
Yes, I mean, an interesting then with regards to talking to Jamie Matthews tomorrow is that Jamie Matthews' paper at A-Life 11 related to taking Dawkins' circa 76 re-memetics and map it onto that idea of, I believe he calls it Chinese whispers. And it was actually a much later paper that he was quoting, I think 2004, Dawkins talking about that phenomena as you describe him showing it at Biota too. So, yeah, Jamie Matthews is an interesting then into that, and I'll talk a little bit with Jamie tomorrow about how he links those two ideas of Dawkins. The reason that I put this topic out in Biota Live came through listening to Bruce talk about the interaction between Dawkins, Adams, and the remaining group at Biota 2, and how, this appears to have inspired a large part of Dawkins' more recent work, particularly in reflecting on the Adams talk. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I don't remember much of the contents of the Adams talk. I'd have to listen to it again, but it was very funny, as you would expect from him, of course. For Dawkins, I'm sure it was an opportunity to take a very different look at what he's been busy with for years and years. He comes from the biological end of things. I'm sure he reads endless numbers of papers and descriptions of experiments and discoveries in the real world of real life, and then being confronted with a bunch of people who are busying themselves with creating and simulating life. I'm sure it tweaked his philosophical bent and got him thinking more in terms of the philosophical angle.
Yes, I think it's an interesting causation that Bruce puts together. Obviously, Douglas Adams passed away, probably 2-3 years after Biota 2. But, Bruce says that there is actually a causal link with regards to Dawkins' most recent work and what occurred at Biota 2. In reading Dawkins' more recent work, do you get the same feeling, or do you think this is Bruce adding something that wasn't actually there?
I don't know. It's a bit of a speculation to talk about what Dawkins is being affected by. I think one of the things that prompted sort of the new atheists to come out with these books was 9/11. People were suddenly thinking in terms of what's going on here, because the best description of this I found was from Dennett, who describes it as a sort of a human missile, something that was comparable to I think it's called a lancet fluke, something that it's a tiny little animal that occupies the brain of an ant and makes the ant climb as high as possible onto a blade of grass in order to be eaten by a mammal, because it's not in the interest of the ant whatsoever to climb up as high as possible, but the ant is uncontrollably compelled to do so by the fluke that has parasitically occupied its brain. So in the same sense, the people who were sufficiently under the influence of absolutist religious convictions were capable of surrendering their own lives in order to achieve something that was not necessarily good for them at all, except for, of course, their beliefs that they would be rewarded. But that's all part of the whole occupation of their minds that happened. So I think the events of 9/11 were probably more a prompting factor in the books of the New Atheists.
So I'm trying to get the reference exactly right, but I think it was Penn Jillette's radio show of maybe 2-3 years ago when they had Professor Dawkins on, and he referred to the fact that he had been discussing the ideas of what would later become the God delusion with his agent for years prior to 9/11. But 9/11 was the turning point in order for the agent to say, now will be the perfect time to write this book. Prior to that, the agent still had concerns. But this is completely off topic with regards to what we're talking about, bar to look perhaps at the linking with regards to the historical figures in artificial life and what they do after they leave talking about artificial life explicitly and how that affects the artificial life community. Now, Dawkins, and this came through when I was chatting with John Riley. I'm not sure if you've heard that Biota Live, but he wasn't aware that Dawkins had any impact on artificial life. And I think what's curious through the historical narrative of artificial life is that there are people who we know about because we're part of the artificial life community. Chris Langton's a good example of that. To a certain extent, well, you've talked about Tom Ray and you've talked about Carl Sims, and people outside the artificial life community, but relatively close, know those names. But, for example, when I was on Floss Weekly, the people who are listening to Floss Weekly wouldn't necessarily know about Carl Sims' blocky creatures. A lot of them know, however, about John Klein's Brevet, which brings that forward in a contemporary setting. But a lot of these names, when they leave the artificial life community and when they're no longer actively promoting or talking about or, you know, a part of the discussion, they don't continue on to promote artificial life in a kind of contemporary setting. Do you feel Dawkins still implicitly promotes artificial life?
I wouldn't say promotes it. I mean, he was way back. He did an experiment with his biomorphs a long time ago, just to explore the idea of genetic variation, and in that case, it was kind of an aesthetic selection, and that can prompt a number of other experiments, and it leads you to think in these terms. For me, it was one of the biggest inspirations from Dawkins. He's written a number of books, and they're all more or less the same theme, but one book stands out in my memory, which is the Extended Phenotype, which is it's a book that describes the bird's nest or the spider web as being a manifestation of the genotype of the spider and the bird. So in that way, you're sort of freed up from the idea of the genotype being the DNA and the phenotype being exclusively the body that the DNA produces. It can be more than the body, and when you cross that threshold, I think that's a real inspiration for artificial life, because you can think of in terms of a genotype being manifesting itself as a phenotype in terms of behavior, which I think is it opens doors for doing that kind of experiment.
But what's interesting with regards to Dawkins' connection with artificial life kind of continuing on is that he still occasionally, in things like TED conference talks, refers to Steve Grand's work. And certainly Bruce, Steve and I have been in some discussion with regards to the potential of Bruce, Steve Grand and Professor Dawkins getting together for some extended dialogue in the future, because certainly Professor Dawkins still talks about Steve Grand's work, and there are still interesting connections. I mean, obviously with regards to the Biota site, I keep a track of that in terms of the hits coming in, particularly when the TED Talks link back into either some of Steve Grand's work on the Biota site or obviously Douglas Adams' presentation at Biota 2. But moving through this, if you were going to give a coherent history with regards to kind of contemporary artificial life and how they link back to these inspirational figures, how do you do it, Gerald?
One thing I would do before I would really dare to do a good, chronological history of it is I would want to sort of dive deeply into what happened in the academic world in the A-Life conferences, for example. Although one of the themes at Biota 2 way back in Cambridge, and I think it was 98, was that the A-Life conferences were they became dry. That's what Chris Langton was saying. It became a lot less inspiring in a way. It became a lot more dry and academic. But I'm still curious. There should be a way to go through the history of the A-Life conferences, the actual academic approach, and see if there are things that can be recognized in there, because a lot of the rest outside of that seems a lot more patchy. So, and academics have this thing for continuity. You know, they constantly cite each other, and everything you write has to be related to something that's already been written, and you know, just expand on it slightly. So there you'll probably find the most continuity. Although, you know, it would be a long study. It would maybe be hard to keep it spicy enough.
Well, I've attempted to do this, and I've attempted to do this with the assistance of Jay Lemon. In fact, I was hoping Jay is the third apology with regards to this evening's discussion, because obviously through doing the Wikipedia article on artificial life and doing the revised edits associated with that, I contacted the Artificial Life Journal and got Jay a wide variety of back issues. There are also a number of the Artificial Life Journal and the A-Life conference papers that are available online. But reconstructing those, you find maybe 3 references that people return to, and that is Langton, Dawkins, and Sims, fundamentally.
Because, you know, you would think that there would be a number of milestones along the way.
You'd think that, and this is what I think is curious with regards to just tracking academic references. That you would think that there are more linking points. And what you find is probably beautiful spirals in some regards, where people start exploring topics and they become fashionable and then they spiral in, and then, you know, another topic. I mean, this is one of the things that I'm really looking forward to discussing with Jamie tomorrow is, and this was certainly Larry Yeager's feedback through his 6 pages, was that there was a lot of new blood and new energy in this year's Artificial Life conference, primarily because it wasn't held in the US. And there seemed to be a lot of graduate students that attended, or perhaps graduate early PhDs. It was a much younger audience than you would see even at of the Grey Thumb meetings that I've seen. And I think from my perspective, that's absolutely fascinating, particularly as a good number of these people are now listening to us talk in some regard as well. But I think there is a new movement, and also in befriending these people on Facebook, as I've done this week, a lot of them are taking actual courses that are teaching them artificial life through some means or another. And this is another reason that it's going to be wonderful to talk to Larry about where he gets his texts from when he teaches people about artificial life.
I was also, you know, really surprised by and pleased with what I heard from Stefan with his talk about, you know, simulating plants, and how elaborate that was, and how you know, it was really intended to mimic as much as possible. It's funny, I was reading just now I think it was something on the wiki page where Tom Ray said he wasn't simulating life, but it was synthesizing life.
Yes, I think what we call it in the future is going to be very interesting. For Dick Gordon's book, you, of all people, will be shocked the most from this, Gerald. I didn't use the term artificial life once in my chapter for Dick Gordon, because
My goodness.
Yes, I know. I'm a reformed artificial lifer. I thought this is ridiculous, because firstly, I don't want to explore, as you say, the paper history. I want to say in 3 to 5 to 10 years, it will be something completely different to what it is now. It's ever expanding. It's not just, you know, genetic algorithms in particular ways. It's a wide variety of other things too. And why would I want to start defining it with a kind of, you know, microscope looking in when really, you know, I need a telescope?
Like we were talking about, you know, there seems to be just a handful of very specific milestones. So it could well be that, you know, in a few years' time there will be a few new ones, but they might not be things that we can predict right now, because it might, you know, somebody might come out of left field and create another milestone like Sims or Tom Ray or Conway, for example. By the way, the reference I gave you this week to the powder game, you played with that a little?
Oh yes.
That is, to me, an incredible piece of work. It's not artificial life, but it would be a really interesting foundation for it.
Well, in some regard, it's fundamental cellular automata in terms of an algorithmic approach. Sure.
Are you sure it's cellular automaton?
When we say that the history of artificial life is relatively abstract, the definitions of these things is relatively abstract too. In terms of the algorithmic approach, it's somewhere between, you know, Conway's life approached in terms of cells and movement. But I think there are Certainly the construction is that there are, 20 different active properties that you can put into the environment?
I don't know, probably more.
Yeah, okay. So there are X number of things that you can put into the environment, and they affect the environment in different ways, and some of them move, some of them manipulate.
The thing has been coded so well. I mean, it's just amazing how it performs, and I can see that as being something that would be useful in exploring sort of the chemical soup approach that Bruce was talking about last week. I
mean, this is something that Bruce and I discussed and it came up today. I mean, I'm probably more likely to call something artificial life and then explore how it's artificial life, as we have done with regards to this particular example, than not. As you may have heard in previous narratives, there was a time when Noble Ape wasn't considered artificial life because artificial life was a very tight set of definitions, and then slowly but surely the definition of artificial life expanded and included Noble Ape and included a wide variety of other projects. So I'd hate to say that things weren't artificial life in the current context, only to be completely out of date in a year or two's time. Returning to this idea of history, do you think it's important currently that we have people like Jay Lemon to create, not necessarily, as we've discussed, a coherent history, but at least something that will enable a kind of improved growth in artificial life? Or are you happy with the existing history as it kind of holds together in a haphazard kind of way?
No, I really think that that the field deserves some sort of synthesizing book that brings it all together and highlights the diverse milestones that have happened. I'm sure that will be useful for for contextualizing the things that are to come. But once again, I have this sense that the next milestone will come from left field.
Do you think there's any way that history can hamper that milestone, or do you think the milestone will occur independent of the narrative we've had to date?
It's hard to say. I don't know. I think, in a lot of ways, just swimming in a history of it for a while and then forgetting it and then going on and doing your own thing is probably the best way to get further. It has definitely some use. I mean, even the academic approach, however many small incremental changes, it's still keeping the subject alive and having getting a group of people together to explore the different aspects of it. And I'm sure there are gems to be found in it, and gems that might just inspire, provide a couple of components for some really interesting development. By the way, I've started a really interesting correspondence with Scott Schaefer. We're really getting into the details of our different projects and really coming together on it. It's going to be interesting. I think we might eventually end up collaborating.
Yes, I think Scott is the kind of mind who is begging for some kind of collaboration. I thought just through proximity, he and Jeffrey Ventrella could get together with regards to some hybridize of Dawkins puddle or whatever it becomes. But I mean, I certainly see a good deal of Ven in what you've been trying to achieve recently with regards to a kind of underlying abstracted genetics, and certainly a lot of his background tinkerings as well. So maybe, I don't know where you guys are currently looking for the solution and collecting your expertise, but that was certainly something that struck me looking at Scott's recent Grey Thumb presentations, was that he may have insights into that aspect of your work as well. Is that the part of you, the overlap that you're seeing currently, or is it something even more diverse?
Well, we're just kind of getting acquainted, but we seem to be thinking along the same lines, and I think there's going to be some correspondences that will amount to a mutual inspiration.
Wonderful, that's great news. And for folks listening for the first time, maybe you've attended A-Life 11, collaboration is one of the main outcomes, or one of the main desired outcomes from the Biota project. We talk about a wide variety of ideas. Certainly Bruce Damer's EvoGrid has received a good airing, and there will be other collective projects that will be discussed in the future. An interesting point with regards to discussing history is, I'm not sure if you've been following Bruce's virtual worlds timeline, Gerald, but the ability to use that kind of technology with regards to artificial life could produce, I don't want to say a wiki-like, because Bruce is talking about a wide variety of different media coming together, including potentially even software. But I mean, the ability to have something like that would certainly be a wonderful reference for someone who is looking to write a history of artificial life. My own sense is that a written history of artificial life, to the richness that you and I have been discussing, Gerald, would probably contain at least 100, if not more, different individuals and projects. I mean, it's in fact a very rich and diverse thing that we are already trying to grasp in the present day. Is that the way you feel about it as well?
Well, suppose you were to put that in book form, theoretically, and suppose it were 100 different things. How much attention could you pay to each of the 100? It would have to be in the form of a 4-page anecdote or something, and then you'd already have a fairly large book. So it's difficult to cover that much ground. I think it's going to be difficult to put it in those terms. The academic world is probably a little too incremental. The history milestones that we've been talking about are a little bit too sparse, and so we've got to find a middle ground probably. The
kind of end between hobbyist and academia currently is the 12 or 16 project collection, which Marco Komachinsky's name springs to mind because he's brought together a couple of these collections in the past and from what it appears, a couple of the collections in the future. But I'm not sure. I think there's also a need for a kind of high undergraduate, graduate student level text that explores this in a similar realm, and it'll be wonderful talking to Larry Yeager as someone who has observed and participated in the history of artificial life, but also has very intimate acquaintance with regards to teaching students about artificial life, how that text could exist, or whether this is the interesting thing. When Bruce and I did our discussion from books to the internet early on in the Biota Live feed, this is always the problem, that by talking about things in the context of books, we're probably already eliminating a good number of the folk who are currently listening to us via podcast form. I mean, do you see this as being an electronic project, or do you still see it needing that physicality of books?
I don't know. The things that Scott and I are really synchronizing, Scott Schaefer and I are really synchronizing on is we're really thinking in terms of abstractions and trying to create some building blocks, and what would be really, I think, important for future projects is if there were some really effective sort of foundational building blocks that could be reused, and that's it's a tall order. I like thinking in terms of abstractions like that very much, and I think I'm really on the right track with the latest approach. I'm creating something I'm calling the blind watchmaker, which is I think it's fundamental and simple enough and deep enough that I think it can be the basis of a number of things. And my goal is to demonstrate several different things based on it, so that people can maybe branch out and do more with it.
Is this the brevet metaphor fundamentally, that it becomes almost like an environment that you create different kinds of artificial life in?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and it's like finding the right abstractions is, I think, one of the most challenging things, and that's the tour I'm on right now. That's the thing I'm trying to accomplish. And by the way, if there's anyone listening who's interested, please contact me, and I'd love to have some more discussions about this. And Scott is also very open to discussion, so we're really trying to establish some sort of core abstractions.
This kind of discussion could easily be framed on the Biota Conversations mailing list as well. Folks interested in joining the Biota Conversations mailing list, go to the Biota site, biota.org, click on the mailing lists, go down to Biota Conv, and subscribe to that, and that will give you the opportunity to chat with Gerald and Scott Schaefer and a wide variety of people who've participated in the Biota podcast to date. What you seem to be describing, Gerald, is almost a need for numerical methods of artificial life, which seems to be really what Dick Gordon is trying to get at as well. Do you see that there's a good degree of overlap between what you're talking about and what Dick's talking about?
Yeah, I guess so. But what you're describing is definitely the core of what we're trying to approach. Is not necessarily numerical methods, but just ways to structure the core of it.
Is this one section will be devoted to multi-agent sustainability, one section will be devoted to genetic algorithms, one section will be devoted to communication involving language? Is this the kind of thing that you're thinking of?
That will require a bit more diverse expertise than just myself and Scott. Very, very willing to have other people get involved to think in those terms and go about creating some of the other building blocks, if possible, for sure.
So for someone listening in, what is your current discussion with Scott relating to in that kind of context?
Well, his idea right now is to have the thinking part of the organism in a sense at a distance and abstracted from the acting part. So there's a separation that provides a kind of abstraction that allow you to swap in different things. His whole theme is pluggability. What I'm working on is the idea of these nuanced instruction sets as being a sort of a generic approach to coding more or less anything based on some sort of genetic backdrop. The genome idea that I'm working on is just as basic as possible, like a stream of binary bits, and the bits come from nowhere. So I think my effort is to make it as core as possible, as fundamental as possible, so that any number of things can be built on the basis of that. So the idea is basically to have instructions compressed to the smallest number of bits possible, so that we can have the greatest diversity of instructions, and these instructions are also nuanced, so you can actually create families of instructions. And the idea is to make it really easy to invent instruction sets to do completely different things.
The solution to date has gone in two directions, and I think what you were describing is almost the scripting solution to this problem. And the other solution has been the kind of plug-in solution to the problem. And ironically, Breve has moved from, well, it still contains the scripting, but now also contains a heavy plug-in solution. And this is ultimately what Bruce is trying to do with moving digital space into artificial life as well, is to have a potential for either scripting on one end or plug-in on the other. Do you see what you're doing as really being part of a kind of scripting language solution where you construct some kind of language that enables these abstract things to be written in, or do you think it's something which is considerably more low level than that?
Kind of both. I mean, on the one hand, you could think of it as scripting, and it can be used as scripting, and that's the first application of it. I've got this focus in the background that I can't really let go of, and that is the idea that what is scripted now could be compiled later. Scott and I have already been discussing the possibility of having the stuff generate Java bytecodes, which are then loaded into the virtual machine. So you're writing machine code with the scripting. So in effect, you bypass the scripting and you get into a domain that that's translated into really fast machine code. And the way I'm approaching this now as well is with vector processors and graphics processors in the back of my mind, which are processors that are very bad at branching. So you've got, if you put code in a graphics processor that has if statements and switch statements, then it doesn't perform well. But if you just have a series of instructions with no branches, then that's, the cat's meow for these kinds of processors. So my idea is that, the scripts will emerge. That's the whole idea of, having this come out of nowhere, but then the scripts will also be compilable into something that is, lightning fast and can be applied to something, then it's bypassing the scripting. It's sort of being realized in machine code. So that's the kind of approach I'm trying to take.
Well, with 3 minutes remaining, another thing that came through the Biota Conversations mailing list was this Eden application that also produces YouTube video clips. And I thought it was a fascinating application of something which, well, one could debate what aspects were artificial life related, but certainly the ability to generate YouTube output, I thought, could lend itself to a wide variety of existing and future artificial life projects in terms of getting the message out relatively rapidly through video. Have you thought about doing something like that with regards to Darwin at Home?
Well, you've seen before that I've been creating films in the past, and I've once again for the Tentegrity project I revived the idea of or the code that does the producing the ray trace images, which can be turned into movies. It's really important to be able to generate output that is in a really accessible form, and movies are really excellent at that. What would also be really good is to get people involved who are interested and capable of doing stuff with audio. And if you can combine that, then you've got more compelling output that really, it has to become accessible. People have to be able to look at it and see exactly what it is and really get their interest tweaked by that.
Yes, audio is audio is absolutely fascinating.
Not much has been done with that. I was really glad to see Jeffrey's work on that domain, but it didn't seem to go very far. It could go a lot farther than that, I think.
The original Noble Ape had an audio component, particularly with regards to the ape's heartbeat and moving towards the ocean and stuff. And I have a lot of real-time source, and OpenAL, I think, is the Apple and potentially other, perhaps Linux implementation. And it's one of those projects that's always just 6 months away with regards to Noble Ape development. But Gerald, we've run out of time. We have less than a minute left. So I'd like to thank you for appearing this evening and having a wonderful chat with regards to history and vening into what you're doing currently. The topic next week, the artificial life, quality of life. I'd like to thank all the folks that are listening to Biota Live for the first time, and particularly thank you very much, Gerald, for the chance to chat with you this evening.
Nice talking to you, Tom.
Always a pleasure.